Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. Now, a divisive topic for techies out there is quantum computing. And yes, it is still in its infancy, and many do debate, sometimes fiercely, if it can ever live up to its hype. And we can expect these debates to intensify after IBM revealed its 127-qubit quantum computer, which is double the size of comparable machines made by Google and the University of Science and Technology of China. So this is a topic I wanted to learn a little bit more about. So I scoured the world looking for an expert, and let me tell you, I am quite excited to get today's guest on here. Her name is Prineha Narang, and she is Assistant Professor of Computational Materials Science at Harvard. And she also heads up NarangLab, where she and her team work on many of the most promising quantum computing technologies. But I don't want to reveal too much already, so no more spoilers. Buckle up and hold on tight, because I'm going to beam your ears all the way to Harvard University in Boston, Massachusetts, so we can speak with Pri about quantum computing, and also she's going to share her inspirational story. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Absolutely. Really nice to be here. My name is Prineha Narang. Nobody calls me that. I go by Pri. I'm here on the faculty at Harvard. I also have a dual role at Alira Quantum as the founder and CTO. And when I'm not doing those two things, I am also a triathlete and a dog mom.
Oh man, how cool is that? There's a lot to unpack there, but I suppose what I should begin by asking you is what about your origin story? Where did your passion for tech come from? What was it that lit that spark inside of you and put you on this path you're on today?
I'm from the East Coast.
Yeah. And
I used to be a track runner. And sometime middle school, high school, I thought to myself, I'm going to be a professional runner. This is very important to me at the time. Still is important to me. But a coach pulled me aside and said, you're good at running, but I hear you're better at this physics thing. I don't think your run times are quite as good as your grades. So you might want to consider spending a little more time pursuing that path. And at first I was like, what? I want to be a runner. This is, a coach essentially telling me I'm not fast enough, but telling me that very nicely. So I started spending more and more time thinking about technology, thinking about physics, thinking about, various things in the lab. I ended up going to grad school in California at Caltech, and that's where I fell in love with theory. So that's a few years past the track conversation I had. And I used to, before I got to Caltech, think that theorists would, work by themselves, very serious people. And what I realized is that theorists are the most collaborative people in science. There's a lot of, let's have some coffee, let's write something on the board, let's discuss it for a while. And that really drew me to, being a theoretical and a computational scientist.
Wow, what an amazing journey. I'm curious, have you met that coach since? And if you haven't, what would you say to them now? A big thank you? Or
I have seen them since, and I did thank them for putting me on this slightly nonlinear path to falling in love with science. I still run, I still do many of those things semi-competitively, but I think the coach was right. Technology is a little more my thing.
I love that. And of course, that path led you to becoming the Assistant Professor of Computational Materials Science at Harvard, where you and your team work on so many of the most promising quantum computing technologies. And it's such a hot topic right now, especially with the IBM announcement last week. So what does the average day look like for you?
I have a team that's about the size of a soccer team. If I play, we could maybe field a spare. And, we think about various ways that we can leverage quantum technologies, the way we can predict different materials, devices that become a part of this big quantum revolution that's being talked about, but also how we can use quantum computers to predict things that are of interest outside of quantum technology. So let me kind of tell you a little more about that, right? So when you think about quantum technologies, there's quantum computing. There's also the other two aspects of it, quantum sensing and quantum networking. And all three of these technologies actually have something in common, which is that you're using the principles of quantum mechanics to do something that classical technologies fundamentally could not. And that includes being able to think about ultra secure communication, or in the case of quantum computing, being able to calculate stuff, to be able to think about various calculations that you couldn't ever do even on the biggest, baddest classical computers. So that in some ways allows us to think about new materials, new molecules, design new quantum systems that could also have applications in other areas of electronics, optoelectronics and photonics, as well as catalysis. There's that nice dual thing there where we're developing new quantum technologies, but also using them for other applications.
And for people listening today that are new to this topic, and there will be a few of them, I know so many people across a wide variety of spectrum here, where some people are excited about it, incredibly excited, others think it's overhyped, and others are a little bit confused by it. So for everyone listening, why quantum technologies and why now?
That's an excellent question. So, when we think about quantum technologies, we're finally getting to a point today in 2021 where we're getting to scale. Yeah. So some of these ideas have been around for a while, using quantum computers to, again, be able to think about these complex many-body states. That's an idea that dates back to Richard Feynman. However, today we're able to build devices that are realizing that vision. And that in some ways makes quantum technologies here today, at that tipping point, at a point where they're coming to all of our lives rather than just being confined to, academia or people who are specialists in the field. Now, there's a lot of skepticism, and I want to acknowledge that, right? There's a lot of talk and there are various timelines that you see, next 6 months, next 18 months, 6 years, depending on who you talk to. I think that at least the way to look at it from my perspective is that there are various approaches people are taking to some of these engineering challenges that lie ahead in quantum technologies. And depending on what path they're taking, whether they're going the superconducting circuit route, which is, of course, the big announcement from IBM, the announcements we've seen from Google, whether they're going the trapped ion route, various companies in that domain as well, or the photonic route, they see different technical hurdles. They see different engineering hurdles. And based on that, they're coming up with a different timeline. So it's not that they're all going the same route and identifying, the same hurdles. They're just taking different routes to the same goal. And that's where you see, different timelines being put forward. So I appreciate how that can cause some confusion, but there's also a reason for optimism there that, they're different, completely independent routes, and each of them has a really good shot at success.
And as you said, you put that beautifully there about all those different routes, and it can be confusing. And just if we look at just people listening to this podcast today, and they're going to be scattered all over the world, and they're going to consist of consumers, engineers, developers, right, business leaders. Just to kind of bring to life what we're talking about here, what do you think quantum holds for them?
Well, a little bit for everyone.
Yeah.
I think the first, killer app, if you will, of quantum computing is in predicting different molecules and materials and being able to do that in conjunction with classical computing. And I want to emphasize that because, there are classes of hybrid classical and quantum algorithms that are showing a lot of promise that, in fact, could allow us to think about better catalysts, think about greener building materials, allow us to think about various hurdles that we are facing today in areas of electronics. We've all been talking about the supply chain issue, for example. So those are all things that, we see coming out of the predictions that people are using with quantum computers, again, in conjunction with classical computers. There's a lot for, at least folks and business leaders who are listening to this podcast in the area of secure communication, in the area of privacy that comes from quantum networks. Quantum networks promise ultra-secure communication. It's physics-based security. There are various ways you'll hear this phrased. And that, I think, holds a lot of promise. It's a little further out than some of the things that we're seeing in quantum computing, but there's a nice synergy there as well, where you can think about quantum networks essentially as being able to connect various quantum devices. And that could be one way of even getting quantum computing to scale. This idea goes also by the name of clustering or distributed quantum computing. So there's a little bit here for, people who are end users of computing technologies, software engineers, software developers who are thinking, how do I get better compute power for an optimization problem? People from a business perspective who are thinking about problems in logistics, problems in finance that could leverage quantum computers. Of course, there are a lot of people from pharma and the chemical industry who are interested in the predictive aspect of what you can do with quantum computers. So it's a little for everyone. And I think all of these will in various forms make their way to consumers soon.
And if we look back over the last 18 months to 2 years, it's amazing just how much has changed. And I think even Microsoft said that they'd had three years of digital transformation inside 3 months. And we've all learned how to work differently, think differently, and adapt. And there's been a lot of bad to come out of the last 2 years, but there's been a lot of good too. And as we're starting to navigate uncharted digital waters, think differently, and re-explore the art of the possible, how should we think about quantum technologies on their impact on a wide spectrum of things, such as applications and industries, etc.?
One of the things we've seen over the last couple of years is that teams can be distributed. And as long as they can access certain resources over the cloud, they're in good shape, right? And that's something we've adapted to. We've adapted to that here in my group. And we've started to think about how the physical proximity to the hardware is not a necessity. And in that sense, I think quantum computing is very natural. It started out on the cloud, right? So an old school analogy here would be, instead of going from the transistor to mainframe to personal computers and then the cloud, we just went transistor to cloud, right? That's what we did with quantum computing. And in some ways, the fact that the last 2 years have taught us how to learn without being in the classroom together, the fact that there are all of these tutorials, even for people who are not in school anymore, that have proliferated, you can learn how to use a quantum device from your home. All you need is a laptop. You need to sign up for one of these free accounts, and you're on your way to programming a quantum computer. And that's something that that would not have been possible without the last 2 years of learning that we've done as a species for how we can work without being in the same room together. So I think there's a lot of technology development that's happening in the field that is distributed across the world. I hear from various, not just startups. Startups have almost always been a little bit faster to adopt new work styles, but very, very traditional companies that have said that their teams are distributed across the world when it comes to quantum, and some of the talent crunch that the field is facing has been ameliorated with that distributed approach. So.
And I'm curious, as someone right in the heart of all this, what are some of the latest developments and recent advancements in the industry that you're noticing?
One of the biggest ones is quantum repeaters, right? Yeah. So this is something that is essential for a scalable quantum network, a network that uses entanglement, you share entanglement across it. Well, it turns out that if your fiber loses all the nice quantum properties that you send over it over 10 kilometers, we're not going to be able to do this across the Atlantic, right? But if you have repeaters, you can actually think about very, very scalable networks, much like we think about classical networks. In the past, year, there have been developments from my group as well as from some of my colleagues here and really across the world that have shown various ways of actually building fault-tolerant quantum repeaters, thinking about quantum memories that are either solid-state based or trapped ion based. And these are, they've gone from being drawings with expected numbers to actually being demonstrated in people's labs. So that's been exciting.
Wow. And again, could some of the theory and computation be relevant to other technologies? And by that, I mean things like photonics and microelectronics, especially with all the shortages at the moment. Is there anything around that you've seen?
Yes. In fact, I'd say that predicting new photonic materials, predicting new electronic materials is something that has energized the community a lot. There used to, and I emphasize the used to here, a reluctance to thinking about new materials in these very scalable production scale, essentially, technologies. And we've seen that reluctance really go down. There's a greater acceptance, is there a nonlinear material like lithium niobate, like barium titanate, so these very, I know this is a little bit of jargon here, but maybe some of the chemists and physicists and in the audience will recognize these names. These used to be considered materials that are high risk. They're not as common as some of the other elements that are used. Well, that's changed. People have embraced the fact that we need to incorporate new materials. We need to incorporate new photonic architectures. And that's something that we're doing a lot of in my group here. We're thinking about how we can predict these materials, how we can think about functionalities that are not just 1 or 5% better than what we have today, but things that are an order of magnitude better than anything you can work with today. So we've been working very closely with foundries, various types of growth techniques to actually think about how we can make that cycle from, prediction, demonstration to incorporation into a real device shorter in time.
And what would you say are the biggest limitations and benefits of quantum tech across computing, networking and sensing? And possibly the most difficult part of this two-part question is, when will it become widely used? I realise that's a pretty big question. As a man of a certain age, I'm still waiting for jetpacks and hoverboards since 1984. So I appreciate it's not that easy. But what are your feelings around that?
I think we're starting to see quantum sensing already in various platforms out there. This is something that people who are deploying new CubeSats, satellites, or even large-scale satellites are adopting much faster. I don't have a quantum sensor network at home. I, too, will be waiting for that for a little while. But I think that people who need the sensitivity associated with some of these technologies are already adopting them in a commercial space. Quantum computing, I think that there's been there's been an influx of people from fields that had nothing to do with quantum, right? So we now see software development. We see a lot of people coming from electrical engineering, people thinking about various aspects of the problem that don't need to be quantum physicists, that don't need to be quantum information theorists. And that's a good sign, because that means that this is actually a technology that's well on its way to making its way into our homes, right? People are talking about, how do I write an operating system for a quantum computer? How do I think about a programming language for it that is different from, what the progression was of programming languages in classical computing. So I think this is all going to transpire within this decade. And I'm not saying that as in my wildest dream this will happen. In fact, there are various roadmaps out there that put us on a reasonable path to us seeing some of these technologies adopted in the next few years. I think quantum networks is a little bit longer horizon, in particular because the repeaters that are necessary for quantum networks are actively being developed today. Having said that, quantum networks use fiber that's already in the ground, right? So there is a scenario in which it could intersect and even surpass some of the quantum technologies that are supposedly earlier on the horizon, if we could figure out that one engineering piece. So there is some wiggle room there with the timeline.
Wow, sounds like incredibly exciting times. And we're going to come full circle now. I'm going to have a little bit of fun with you. We started the podcast talking about your origin story. What put you on this path? I'm now going to ask you, what was the soundtrack to that origin story? What was the soundtrack to those runs when you're heading for those PBs each time out there on the track? Or a song that just reminds you of your career in tech? Is there a song and a story you can share with us? And we'll add that song to our Spotify playlist. No pressure at all.
Does it have to be a single song?
Well, what springs to mind immediately? If you can't split two, then we'll see what we can do.
The songs I listen to when I go on a run change on maybe, every couple of weeks. I get bored and my playlist changes. But this past couple of weeks, I've been logging actually a fair bit of mileage with a race coming up. So I started listening to some music from League of Legends. This is very nerdy, but maybe there are some people who play video games who are familiar with League of Legends. And there's a song there very aptly titled "Awake," and I thought to myself, well, it's from the League of Legends soundtrack. And every morning, especially now that it's a little colder outside, I put that on and I think to myself, and this is how I'm going to take that first step out the door. Of course, once I get moving, I totally can forget about it. It's 32 out Fahrenheit. But another song that, well, not so much song. I've always been a fan of jazz, and of course, I listen to my fair share of Charlie Parker, and I go to, there's a local jazz club here that frequently has concerts by Sheila Jordan, who of course now is in her 90s, but still performs. Wow. And I am drawn to that, but that's not so much my running music as it is my working music. So.
Wow, man, that's amazing. Well, I get those added to the Spotify playlist. The only thing I find myself asking, though, as someone that's incredibly busy, I know not only your multiple job roles there, I know you're chatting to me on a podcast and you're rushing off to go to a panel in a moment. Where do you find time to play League of Legends? Because that takes time, doesn't it?
I'm not very good. So that's... I can appreciate the music. That's but if you ask me, well, what's your ranking? That would not be such a such an impressive answer, let's say. But I realize that a lot of students actually that's really where I've kind of found ways to connect with students and particularly undergraduate students, where, if you can talk to them about something that is of interest to them, a game they're playing, thing they're interested in, that can frequently draw them into science. So I would go to, some of these events where people would say, well, let's play a video game, and then maybe over pizza, you can tell us a little bit about this thing you're working on. It's been a very effective recruitment strategy. So.
Wow. Well, I think we've covered everything today, haven't we? From running to tech, quantum computing, and League of Legends. But for people that want to find out more information about anything that we talked about today, maybe contact your team or just look up and stay in touch with the developments. What's the best starting point?
My group website, narang.cs.harvard.edu, I can send you a link to it, is cool. The best spot. Please connect with me on LinkedIn, Prineha Narang. I don't know if anyone else who has that same name, or NarangLab on Twitter. And all of those will lead you to finding me, particularly for people here in the audience who are thinking of joining this field and don't know, what should I read first? What course should I take? I love receiving those emails, and you can find basically all my contact information on the website. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I'll have that link so people can find you nice and easily. But I've interviewed, nearly 2,000 people on here, and I always ask about the origin story and what put them on this path. And I'm always amazed by how the universe seems to give us all that little nudge in the right direction. And yours is going to be one of those stories that stays with me for a long time, where you were so focused on running and the power of that coach pulling you to one side and nudging you in a slightly different direction, where that's took you. Absolutely amazing. But also for learning more about quantum technologies and why now is so important, and all the great work you're doing. So thank you so much for sitting down.
Thank you for having me here. Awesome.
Wow, what an amazing story. And I just love chatting with her today about quantum computing. And I know this is a hot topic with techies, and we do have listeners all over the world. There's going to be many different views on quantum computing, quantum technologies, where it's taking us, the real capabilities. But what are your opinions on anything we talked about today? And do you think we need additional metrics to assess performance rather than just qubit counts? Whatever it is, please, I urge you to share your stories, insights, experiences by emailing me directly, techblogwriter@outlook.com. You can also send me a direct message on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, etc. Just look for @NeilC.Hughes. And if you'd like to work with me, if you need any help with business blogs or launching your own podcast, my website is techblogwriter.co.uk. So all that's left for me to say really is a big thank you to today's guest for coming on here and sharing her story. And an even bigger thank you to each and every one of you for tuning into this podcast. I know I do send at least one interview a day over to you, sometimes more, and I know that's a big ask, so I appreciate you all. But until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.